Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking about light and shadow this week and talking about how light and shadow can be used to reinforce a sense of volume that we've established through other techniques. So through perspective, through line weight, partially through proportional observations. People have said a couple times in the crits that they feel like they won't be able to really show volume until they start using light and shadow. But that's not entirely true. Or I think that that's a little bit misleading, because light and shadow should not be thought of as being entirely responsible for creating a sense of volume and space. It should be thought of as reinforcing volume and space. So you always want to be thinking about using light and shadow in conjunction with other ways of representing volume and space, if it's going to work as well as we want it to. So I like to start this lecture on light and shadow with this image. And this is just a randomly found image online of some kind of generic office space. And the reason I like to start with this is because this is the way we typically experience light in our everyday life. So in a way, at this point in history, we take light for granted, right? Light is, for most of us, probably for all of us here, where we are, meaning where we are in the world, in industrialized society, light is everywhere, all the time available, right? And so when we walk into a room, we flick on a few lights and we have lights coming from multiple directions. So we have lights, very often from above, from various other sources. We have this desk lamp here, from sources that aren't exactly meant to be light sources, like computer screens or television screens, from our phones, right? So light is emanating from everywhere, not to mention from windows, right? So we don't really even think about light and shadow. Where one time in history, and people may be familiar with this, human beings were hyper aware of light and shadow, and everything in a person's life was structured according to when there would be light and when they knew there wouldn't be light. Even, I don't know if anyone's encountered these recent findings that our sleep patterns have been altered because of the changing availability of light. So we never think about light. We never think about how light operates on forms, how light transitions into shadow. It's just not part of our consciousness because light is everywhere available. And it's a constant presence in our lives. We're going to think about light and shadow very carefully, and how light and shadow can be used in drawings to create a very convincing illusion, again, in conjunction with other techniques, a very convincing illusion of three-dimensional volume on a flat surface. So this is a Vermeer painting. This is a painting that's in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think it's one of the great paintings in American collection. So for that reason alone, I recommend people go see it. But this is an example of light from a previous time, right? So Vermeer is making this painting sometime in the middle of the 1600s. I don't remember the exact date. It's a very famous painting, along the lines of his approach to subject matter, where he's depicting a kind of everyday worker going about her daily tasks in the home of we assume a wealthy merchant, or what's supposed to be the home of a wealthy merchant. And she is doing her tasks under the kind of light that she would typically find herself under, which is a single source of light in here coming from a window. Right? So people at one time in history would find themselves under a single source of light. So again, either coming from a window in a room, right, where there would have been no other sources of light available, or they would have been outside. We're going to go back to that kind of lighting situation to really study how light and shadow operates on objects. So what happens to the way we perceive an object when light falls on it? And people probably at least intuitively know that the only reason we see objects is because light falls on them, right? Light falls on an object, it reflects off the object, it carries certain visual information back to our eyes, and then it's processed in the brain, and that's the only reason we see anything. So we're going to study how light and shadow creates our ability to see objects. That's not quite true. We're going to be studying what happens to light when it falls on an object, and how it transitions into shadow, and how we can understand what exactly happens under those conditions. So again, we're going to be studying light and shadow under very controlled conditions, always under a single light source, so that we can start to understand all of the elements of light and shadow that are relevant for us as artists. And once you understand the elements of light and shadow under these kind of controlled conditions, then you're much better able to figure out what's happening with the light and shadow under more typically encountered situations, if you choose to make drawings or paintings under those conditions. So this is a 19th century figure drawing by an artist named Pierre-Paul Prud'homme, who was a French neoclassical painter. And his entire life, he did these sort of laborious studies of the human figure, which was a little bit unusual at that time. This would have been typically, this kind of drawing would have typically been done by a student only. But Prud'homme, and I'm not even sure why, continued to produce these throughout his entire life. I find them very beautiful. I find these more beautiful than his paintings, which are kind of static, classical, overly staged works. I'm showing this because it very clearly reveals to us the elements of light and shadow on a simple object, or here a not simple object, here a human figure. Let me just skip forward for a second. So before I talk about any further about this image, let me skip forward to light on a simple form. So here we have a drawing of a simple sphere, right? And this is a relatively common exercise in a certain kind of drawing class, where students will do a drawing of a simple sphere under a controlled lighting situation. And I would have done, instead of doing an egg today, I would have done a sphere, but it's actually a little bit difficult to get a hold of a sphere. So I figure everyone can get a hold of an egg. So what happens to an object when it's illuminated by a single light source? So what we end up having is we have a light mass, or we can think about the light and shadow in actually relatively simple terms. So on the one hand, we see a kind of infinite range of values, right? From the darkest value around here, which is not black, but it's a very dark gray, to the lightest value, which is probably not quite white, but very close. And then in between those two values, we have this vast range, right? We could maybe even say an infinite range of different values. And just to remind people, in case not everybody is familiar with these terms I'm using, value just means the degree of lightness or darkness right? So this is a very light value, and this is a very dark value. So value is the degree of lightness or darkness. That's what the term value means when we're talking about drawings or paintings or prints or photographs or any, whatever work of art we may be dealing with. So, but we don't need to get bogged down in this vast infinity or this vast range of values that we may think we can detect in what we're looking at. We can understand what's happening in very simple terms. So let's break this down into those simple terms. There's, on the one hand, a light mass that's created. So the light's coming from the upper left, and it's illuminating all of the surfaces of the object that are facing the light source, from the surfaces of the object that are directly facing the light source. In other words, that surface there is about parallel to the plane of the light source. And then as planes start to turn away, they're still facing the light source, but they're not quite as clearly positioned parallel to the light source, right? They're starting to turn away from the light source. As those surfaces, or what we're going to be calling planes, turn away from the light source, they start to lose intensity of light, right? So this is a white sphere. So as the planes on the sphere turn away from the light source, we lose the ability to perceive the fullness of the value. In other words, exactly how light it is. And the object becomes progressively darker. So this is darker than this. This here is darker than this, right? So as the surfaces turn away or the planes turn away, they start to move into shadow. And then at a certain point on the form, and the common, what is now the common term for the point on the form where there is no longer light hitting it, that is called the terminator. So along this edge is where the form no longer faces the light source. And so again, that's commonly nowadays referred to as the terminator. I've always called it the shadow edge because when I was a student, the word terminator was not in use. That seems to have come into use in the past 15 or 20 years. And it's actually, I wondered where that term came from. It apparently comes from the term used to describe where the moon goes into shadow. In astronomy, that's referred to as the term terminator. Shadow edge or terminator is where light is no longer hitting the volume. So then we have the shadow mass. So we have our light mass here, and we have our shadow mass. And in this case, this form or this shadow mass is crescent shaped. So if no light is hitting an object, in theory, we can't see it. But the only reason we see things is because light is hitting them and then reflecting off of that surface and bouncing back to our eye. But we can see stuff in here, right? With this, it's not like this goes totally black, right? Totally outside of our ability to perceive it. So why can we still see information on this side of the form? If there's no longer direct light hitting it, why are we still able to see things?
Because there's indirect light hitting it.
There's indirect light hitting it, right? And where is the indirect light coming from?
Maybe like reflecting off the floor back up to the object.
Right, that's right. So actually, so that's right. That's the most important source of the reflecting light. So light's passing by the object and then bouncing off of all of these surfaces and back into the shadow plane back into the shadow planes. Back into the shadow planes on the object. There's actually lights bouncing off walls, all around and filtering back in, but primarily the light is bouncing off of this reflective surface. So that property or that element of that aspect of what's happening in this situation gives the name to this part of the light and dark situation. So we have light mass, shadow mass. Anyone know what this lighter area within the shadow is called? Anyone ever come upon that term? Okay, so that's this area, whoops. This area is called the reflected light. So I'm not going to test people on these terms, but you should start trying to remember them just so we are communicating with each other and we know what we're saying, right? Because I'm going to now, for the rest of the semester, I'm going to start referring to all of these elements of light and shadow. These are going to be a very important part of what we're doing. So again, light mass, shadow mass, and then here, this is called the reflected light. And there's always reflected light on objects that you're drawing. Now, whether it's clear or less clear is another issue, but there's always reflected light. That reflected light creates another important element of light and shadow, which is this darker band right here. So I'm going to ask again, it doesn't seem like people have studied light and shadow. Anyone know what this is called? So this darker band of shadow, again, so just to explain what that is, we have light creating this light mass, and then where the surfaces of the object are no longer facing the light source, they turn away from the light source and they turn into shadow. Then we have reflected light bouncing back into the shadow, creating this reflected light, what we call the reflected light. This is referred to as the core of the shadow, C-O-R-E. So the core of the shadow is that darker band of shadow that happens near the shadow edge and is created, it's a darker area of shadow because it's neither getting direct light nor is it getting reflected light. So we have light mass, dark mass, reflected light, core of the shadow. And these, again, all of these elements are elements that will be perceivable on any form we look at. I was going to say that is being illuminated by a light source, but in a way that's redundant because if we're seeing a form, it's illuminated by a light source. So anyone know what this shadow is called? This, by the way, let's get this out of the way. This dark mass on the object is often called the form shadow because it's the shadow that's on the form itself. So this total area that includes the core of the shadow and the reflected light is called the form shadow. This shadow here, we refer to with a common name. It's a name we use in everyday language, even if we don't use it commonly. Anyone know what we might call this? Okay, and maybe this is maybe there's an obvious answer to this, but anyone want to say why we see this shadow here? Like what's creating this shadow?
The sphere is blocking the light from getting to the floor in that.
Right,
space.
the sphere is blocking the light. And you can figure out where this is called the cast shadow. It's the shadow that's cast on a surface by the object under a light source. And you can find where the location of the cast shadow by simply following lines from the light source to the outer surface of the object and down to the surface that it's blocking. So this cast shadow is a shadow that's created by light being blocked by the form itself. And the cast shadow is extremely important because it helps set up the space that the object is seen under. So we have form shadow, cast shadow, reflected light, core of the shadow. The darkest shadow you can identify in a situation is either in more common everyday speech called the shadow accent. That's always what I called it. But again, since I was a student and since I first studied these things, more sort of technical jargony terms have come into use. It's actually because this kind of drawing has become much more common. A kind of return to traditional drawing has become much more common in the past 20 years. In part, I think, because CGI, computer generated imagery, uses or went back to using traditional methods of creating the illusion of objects in environments. And I think that in part sparked a return, or that contributed to a return to an interest in this kind of drawing again. Anyway, so when I was a student, we just called this the shadow accent. Now you'll hear it referred to as the occlusion shadow, OCCLUSION. It's the place on the setup where virtually no light is reaching. So light is reaching this part of the cast shadow because it's bouncing off of various surfaces. This crevice here where we're getting a smaller and smaller gap between the sphere and the tabletop is receiving almost no light. So that's called the occlusion shadow. And that's often almost black. Okay, so again, I'm going to be repeating these just so we start to develop a common language. We have our light mass, our dark mass, form shadow, cast shadow, core of the shadow, reflected light, and occlusion shadow. So there are two elements now, two remaining elements of light and shadow that I want to emphasize. So these are two very bad images or poor quality images that I screenshotted from a video. This is the beginning of a drawing of a sphere, not exactly the same sphere, but very similar. And we're going to be doing something like this as the start of our egg. So this is the beginning of the drawing of a sphere. So what's an important difference between the light and shadow on this sphere and the light and shadow on this sphere? I know, again, a kind of obvious question, but still think worth talking about. What's an obvious difference?
The second one is very harsh.
Right, the one we just looked at is very harsh, right? So the artist has set up a very clear and simplified light and dark situation. What the artist has started to do is go from this very stark division, and they've started to turn this edge. You can actually see the artist starting it here. So they're starting to add values that show us how the object slowly transitions from the side of it that is not in light to the side of it that is in light. So, and we see that now in this drawing fully developed. So we have the core of, the shadow edge right here, right where we go into the full darkness. But along that shadow edge are these transitional values that turn the form from the shadow into the light. And we refer to these as halftones. Sometimes midtones. I'm going to be referring to them. I probably use those terms interchangeably. I think I usually say halftone. So all of these tones, so these are halftones that are transitioning the shadow into the light. But any value that is any value that's darker than the lights but lighter than the darks is referred to as the halftones. So there's halftones, and we've left out one final element of light and shadow. This is a kind of subtle depiction of it, so we don't see it very clearly here. Can anyone think of an element of light and shadow? This is another element of light and shadow that people are usually familiar with, even if they haven't studied this. But can anyone think of another element of light and shadow that we're leaving out?
Highlight.
Highlight, right. So we see the highlight right here. And the highlight is always the lightest part of the object. And the highlight has to do with, the highlight is not necessarily the place that is most directly facing the light source. A highlight is an optical effect that's created by that will appear on the object where there is an equality of the angle of the light and then the angle of reflection back to your eye. So I know that probably doesn't sound very clear. We're actually going to watch a video to reinforce some of these elements of light and shadow. And the person in that video explains it more clearly. He has this kind of animation that he uses, but I think he'll talk about it usefully. So we're going to be talking about how to use these elements of light and shadow to reinforce a clear sense of volume. So I'm going to go out of my sequence here. So we have, again, I've just flipped this drawing. We have our sphere of light and shadow. So we have our light and shadow in that very simple form. And then let's look at this much more complex form, right? A much more complex rendering. You know, in a sense, the kind of drawing that this class is designed to lead to. Now, Proudhon, when he did this drawing, was an extremely experienced artist. So I'm not saying that I expect anyone to do a drawing like this, but this is what we're sort of aiming for. So in other words, so not necessarily this kind of classical interpretation, but what we're aiming for in this class is an absolutely convincing illusion of three-dimensional, fully realized, palpable, three-dimensional volume in a believable three-dimensional space. And again, going back to something I harp on over and over again, making the viewer believe that's what they're looking at, in spite of the fact that they know that this is really just a two-dimensional flat surface. So what Proudhon is doing here really is taking these elements of light and shadow as they are understood on a very simple form and simply applying them to this more complex form, just with varying degrees of variation from the simple form. So what do I mean by that? So let's imagine, and I think we can imagine that, let's imagine this figure's hips as a kind of sphere-like form. So notice how the hips have this light mass, right? And it's a more complicated, less regular light mass than the sphere, but still it's a light mass on an object that's created by light coming from the upper right. And now that I've flipped this drawing of a sphere, the light's coming from the upper right. And then the form, as the form rolls away from the light source, right about here, as the form rolls away from the light source, it goes into shadow. So it's no longer illuminated. None of these surfaces are illuminated. We get reflected light, right? So this part of the form is more illuminated than this part, or than this part, right? Because it's receiving reflected light off of reflecting surfaces. And that reflected light, that lightening of the shadow mass, is creating this very visible core shadow on the hips. We get the cast shadow from the volume of the figure blocking the light. We get these occlusion shadows. And then we have the halftone, right? The halftone that softens the edge of the shadow and rolls the form into the light mass. We get these halftones. We get a highlight. We have halftones showing us the smaller volumes within the light side of the form. We have a complexity of halftones, revealing those small planar surfaces as they turn in different directions and therefore have different relationships to the light source. So the more turned away a surface is from the light source, the darker it's going to be. So this surface here is facing the light source. This surface here is turned away at an oblique angle. This surface here, as the muscles on the shoulder blade turn under, that's even darker because it's more turned away from the light source. This is completely turned away from the light source. And so we can always understand light and shadow and the way we render light and shadow as an understanding of the way the planar surfaces of the object we're looking at are turned in different directions relative to the light source. So this drawing here, I will post this on Blackboard. This gives us, or I've indicated all the different elements of light and shadow, so people can refer to this. And I'll also post an image of that of the sphere drawing with the same labeling. So what we're going to do is something like this drawing, again from a 19th century drawing book by Charles Bark. This shows the way the artist starts the block in of light and shadow. So tracing out the planes, the major planes of light and dark, the major light and dark planes, blocking in a very simple situation of light and dark. So this is how we're going to be approaching it. We're going to be really emphasizing an approach to rendering light and shadow where we start with utter simplicity, the simplest breakdown of light and shadow that we can manage. And then we're going to progressively complicate it from there. And the reason for that is because that's a principle of drawing and painting and sculpture, for that matter, that is always valuable and I think should always be utilized, which is always to go from the large effects or the large masses down to the smaller masses. So you go from the large forms to the details and not the reverse. So we're always going to be starting with the simplest, largest breakdown of light and shadow, and then going progressively to a more complex depiction of it. And there are, by the way, examples of Proudhon's drawings where you can see his starts. And his start is very much like this, where he starts by just laying in these big shapes of light and shadow masses. So we're going to be doing something like this today in our drawing of the egg, going from this to this to this. And so if we just look at drawings from throughout history, as we have done so far in this class, or at least to some extent, you'll start to now see that they are always illuminated with a single light source. They always have a light mass, a dark mass, and those different elements of light and shadow. So the large light mass, light coming from the upper left, light mass, shadow mass. So Michelangelo is not so strongly emphasizing the dark value as Proudhon does, because Michelangelo wants room to figure out those little muscles within the darks, but still light mass, dark mass, light mass, dark mass. This is a drawing by Peter Paul Rubens. Again, a drawing by Rubens, light mass, shadow mass, right? So the light coming from the upper left. This is a more contemporary drawing by Charles White. Light, again, coming from the upper left. So we have the light mass, the dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light, highlights. Even in this expressionistic drawing by Max Beckmann, the artist is using a light side on the right, the light's coming from the right, and the planes of the face turn around in space into the dark mass. Again, light mass, in this Katie Kollwitz drawing, let's concentrate here on the thigh, the light mass, shadow mass, reflected light, core of shadow, highlight, the beginnings of the indication of the halftone. This is a contemporary drawing by a painter who's still working today named Lysias Scavage, same situation. So this is really when artists are using light and shadow to clearly render volume. They are virtually always, except for very, very specific, rare situations, using this principle of illuminating an object with a single light source. Okay. So any questions about any of that, or can I clarify any point we've made? Okay, so new share. Okay, so for the drawing this week, I've ripped the paper in half. So this is now 12 by 18. If you want to rip it in half even further and do this drawing on a, what would it be, a 9 by 12 drawing, that's fine. You don't want to be doing this drawing on a large drawing. I mean, we're not really using a drawing tool, a large piece of paper. We're not using a drawing tool that's going to allow you to very easily make a large drawing. So I'm just sharpening my pencil the way I always do. And I'm going to start with an HB, but again, that's up to you what you want to start with. So I have a very simple egg here, right? And as usual with my low-tech camera setup, you're looking at some things in a certain distorted way, like the egg isn't so sphere-like. So the view I'm taking is more something like that. And by the way, so I don't have the egg set up in a box because my studio, and I think I've pointed this out before, just has a single window. And I have reinforced that to make the light a little bit more clear. I'm using this LED light. Without the LED light on, the light's a little bit too subtle for me to be able to do a really clear demo. So that's my lighting situation. If you genuinely are able to work in a room where you just have a single window like this and the light doesn't change, in other words, the sun never comes in. So if you genuinely have that situation, then you can get away without using a box. Or if you have a room that doesn't have any windows and you can just have a single light source illuminating the objects you use, then you can get away without using a box. Otherwise, you need to get the box to block out any competing light sources. Okay, so we're going to be going through the process of rendering an object let me actually show you all something else that I always show a video that really goes over some of the same information we've just gone over, but it does it in a way that I think is very useful and really helps clarify some of, all of those elements of light and shadow. So let me pull that up and we'll watch that before we go on to this demo. Can you see me? I'm on YouTube now. Can you see that, or do you just still see the second camera?
No, just still the camera.
Okay, so let me just switch the screen.
This is my Penn State World Campus classroom.
Okay, do you see YouTube now?
Yep.
Giving students like me the full
Can you
Penn
hear
State
it?
Yes.
So by the way, this guy, he goes by Proco. He actually has it's a little bit obnoxiously goofy, like he thinks he's funnier than he is, but he actually does have some useful tutorials on drawing. So if anyone's interested in exploring tutorials, and there, as I've said, I think in this class, there are actually now tons of them. Okay.
Hey, welcome to Proco. My name is Stan Prokopenko. A lot of you have been asking for a video on shading. The first thing you need to understand when starting to shade is how light affects the appearance of form and how to properly capture the three-dimensional form based on the characteristics of the light in the scene. In some of my previous videos, I talked about things like shapes, values, and edges. But how do we know what shapes, values, and edges to draw? What exactly are we looking for? Well, we're looking at light and how it illuminates the objects in our picture. Light is the reason we see anything, and the characteristics of the light can completely change the appearance of the objects it illuminates. So I like to analyze the light in the scene and try to capture it so the viewer can feel the light. Form looking three-dimensional is just a byproduct of correctly capturing the light on the form. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that studying light on form is important. Now let's take a look at all the elements. For this, I'm going to need an egg. For this, I'm going to need an egg. There are two main zones, light and shadow. The edge where the form transitions from light to shadow is the terminator. It's located at the tangent between the light source and the form. In other words, just before the planes start to face away from the light. Let's start by talking about the shadow side. There are two types of shadows. Form shadow is a shadow caused by the planes turning away from the light source. A cast shadow is caused by one form blocking the light from hitting another form. This egg is blocking the light from reaching this part of the table. You can find this shape by projecting lines from the light source to the terminator of the first form and continuing those lines to the obstructed form. Shadows will rarely be completely black. Light bounces off objects in the environment and is reflected back into the shadows. This is called reflected light. In this case, the light will bounce off the paper and into the shadow on the egg. Along the terminator, sometimes you'll see a core shadow. It's a darker plane that defines the edge of the shadow. The thickness and softness of the core shadow can vary quite a bit. It depends on the thickness of the form, how sharp the edge is between the planes of light and dark, or the angle and position of the reflecting light source. Sometimes you won't see the core shadow at all, only if there is something on the shadow side to reflect back enough light to create a visible difference in value. This dark piece of paper reflects less light than the white paper. You can see a drastic difference in the value of the reflected light. Also, regarding the visibility of a core shadow, the reflection has to come from the right angle. If it's directly behind the shadow side, it will create a nice core shadow. If we move the reflection source closer to the angle of the main light source, it will illuminate the area where the core shadow would have been. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in because it can add to the three-dimensionality of the form.
So that's a really important point he makes there. He says often if an artist doesn't see a reflected light, they'll cheat one in. Or maybe he said the core shadow. Those two things go hand in hand. And that's a really important point because we're not just copying mechanically what we're looking at, right? We're always in a process of interpreting what we're looking at. And when you have a painting or a drawing that has a clarity of light, dark, core shadow, reflected light, you're able to achieve a greater sense of full volume because we start to think we can actually read all the different elements of the form as they're turning around in space. So again, he says, even often when artists don't see a core shadow and a reflected light, they'll cheat one in. And cheating in certain information is something always to be aware of. You know, when done right, it's very useful.
Reflected light doesn't just affect form shadows. It also affects cast shadows. Less light can bounce into this deep crevice where the egg and table meet, and so that area gets darker as it goes deeper. This is called an occlusion shadow. Moving on to the light zone. Immediately after the terminator is the halftone. These are planes of the form that are partially hit by the direct light. As the planes get closer and closer to facing the light, they will get lighter. And the point where the form points directly at the light is called the center light. Don't confuse the center light with the highlight. The difference between the two is that the center light is the plane facing the light source, whereas the highlight is a reflection of the light source. A reflection will move depending on where the viewer is. Let's say this is the egg. The viewer or the camera is down here, and the light source is over here. The center light will be here facing the light source. The highlight, however, will need to be at the point where the light can bounce off the surface of the egg and reach the viewer's eyes. These two angles need to be equal. If you've played billiards, this is very similar. To test this concept, let's mark the point of the highlight. And mark another point for the center light. Now let's move the camera and see what happens. Okay, you can see here that the highlight moved to a different spot, following the camera. The center of light hasn't changed. It's still pointing directly at the light source. Don't let the math of all this confuse you. Highlights and cast shadows that we discussed earlier can be changed, and they'll still look believable. Nobody's going to call you on a highlight being in the wrong spot. I can take the highlight on this egg, move it to a different spot, and change the shape, and it still looks believable. I will often change the shape of a cast shadow to better describe the form it's being cast onto. For example, if I have an object that casts a shadow appearing to go against the form of this paper towel roll is a cylinder, and to show that, I would change the cast shadow from the egg to wrap around the cylinder. I usually try to describe the form that the shadow is casting onto rather than the form casting the shadow. So give yourself artistic license. Learn the rules, and then learn how you can break the rules to improve your drawing. Just want to let you guys know, I'll be releasing a DVD very soon, so keep your eyes out. It's going to have all the video tutorials I've done so far, plus a few extras that'll be available only on the DVD. I'm hoping to have it available in the next few weeks. And as always, if you like this video.
Okay, so I like to show that he essentially repeated information that we've gone over, but I think first of all, it's useful to reinforce it. And also he has access to certain kinds of animation that I think makes it more clear. I'll also post this video. Okay, so again, I'll just ask any questions about anything before we go on to the. Okay, so everybody can see the setup, right? Okay, so we have set up here. I have an egg set up under a simple light source. And so we're going to go through the process of rendering the light and shadow on this egg. Okay, so I have it set up on a black tabletop in large part for the reason that was indicated in the video we just watched. If it's on a white surface or a lighter surface, a great deal of light reflects back into the shadow, and it can be somewhat misleading. So I put it on a black surface to minimize the reflection, but we can still clearly see, and I'm sure everybody can see this now, we can identify all the elements of light and shadow. So we have the light mass, dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light, occlusion shadow, just ignore that piece of tape there. That's just to hold the egg. I think we can even see the highlight. So when you're doing your drawing, don't do a life-size egg. Make a relatively large form so that you're really dealing with so that you're really giving yourself enough space to really figure out how to use these elements of light and shadow. So I'm blocking in a very simplified contour of this egg. And I'm using the same approach we've used so far, which is to start the block in by simplifying the contour into a series of straight lines. So that I can get as convincing a representation of that shape as possible. So just like anything I'm drawing, I'm trying to, I'm looking at proportion. I'm looking at, for this, in the case of this egg, I want to make sure I have the axis of the egg. In other words, what's the angle the egg is sitting at on the table? So if I were to imagine an axis running along the, running horizontally or running between the two extreme points along the length of the egg, I'm looking at what the angle of that axis is, and it's a slight angle down to the left. And just like with anything we draw, don't be fooled by the simplicity of this shape, or what we perceive to be the simplicity of it, and think that it's necessarily an easy thing to capture. Never is. So I'm looking very carefully, trying to really get the precise shape of this. So again, your view of the egg is a little bit distorted. So the egg on the screen, unfortunately, looks a little bit squat. So you don't have quite perception of the length to the height. So again, using those techniques we've used, block in the contour, and get a convincing depiction of the shape of the object. I'm using the same technique. So I'm going to lay in the central axis. And I want this, ultimately, I want the egg to be convincingly symmetrical, because we can assume that the egg is roughly symmetrical. It's probably not exactly symmetrical. I think I'm in pretty good shape. So now I'm going to place that in a space. So I'm going to look at the angle of the tabletop in relationship to the shape of the egg, because I want to place this in an environment. And so the tabletop is running at an angle. Again, because the camera in relationship to the egg is at a slightly different relationship than my eyes are, you're going to see the angle of the table in relation to the egg slightly differently. Now I'm going to find that angle and check that. So it's about light. So in your drawing, include the edge of the table. Okay, so one thing, again, I chose to put the egg on a black surface so that I could minimize the light reflecting off the surface and back into the shadow mass on the egg. So I want to avoid too much reflected light back into the surface. One thing I sacrifice when I do that is I sacrifice the clarity of the cast shadow. So notice if I had a white, if the egg were on a white surface, we would very clearly see the cast shadow like we do here. I'm going to take away this white surface. And I think you can still see, as I can, you can still see, although it's subtle, but you can still see a cast shadow here. You can see a bit of a cast shadow on the wall. So I'm still going to put in the cast shadow, and I'm going to do it as if I see the cast shadow as clearly as I do there. And I'm going to do that because I want to give a clear sense of the egg sitting in a space. And the way to do that is to show the cast shadow on that surface that's being blocked by the form of the egg blocking the light. So I'll clean up my contour a little bit. And I will, so people, by the way, people mentioned last week in the crits that they were having trouble getting what appears to be a straight line just by hand. And it's always a challenge, but try to do it. You can always go in if you really want to and reestablish a really straight line with a ruler. try to develop the ability to make what appears to be a straight line. So I'll keep cleaning this up. Because if you're able to make a line by hand that appears straight, then you're drawing us the advantage of being seeming both sort of architecturally structural, but also it has the vitality of being handmade. So I always try to recommend people do that. Or try to develop the ability to make what appear to be straight lines by hand. Okay, so now, so I have my egg blocked in, the contour of my egg. I have the space roughed in, and just to give you a slightly better view of that. No, actually, I am here. I'm going to, in spite of everything I just said, I'm going to just clean this up a little bit because I'm not convinced by, yeah, I guess it is. Didn't look to me totally straight, but I guess it is. Okay. So there's a table edge here, which I'm not going to draw just to make this, not to add unnecessary complications. So I'm going to imagine where that shadow ends. So I'm going to take a quick photo so I can so I can document this for Blackboard. Okay, so now let's analyze the light and shadow on the object and look at what's happening with the division of light and shadow. So I think everyone can clearly see we have a division between light and shadow that happens right along here. And so that's the point on the object where the form turns from light into shadow. So I'm going to use the exact same technique I've been using for the primary contour. I'm going to block in that contour by simplifying it into a series of straight lines or tight arcs that wrap around, that move around the volume itself. So what I don't want to do is turn this into, you'll see that edge is just this. Because that's going to become, that's first of all not reflective of what we see up there. but it's also going to too easily be read as a two-dimensional shape. So I'm going to try to see how that shape or how the shadow shape turns very precisely as it rolls up or as it crawls across the specifics of this volume. So if I really look carefully at the shadow edge, shadow edge is rolling. Some little. The shadow edge is crawling around the specifics of this organic form. I'm going to try to capture the specifics of what that edge does as it walks or crawls across specifics of this form. So the form isn't just a kind of generic graphic line, right? As that form rolls around, or as the shadow edge rolls around the form or walks across the form, it's turning at distinct points on the form where there's an abrupt change in direction. So I want to find those specifics. So if we were working with a perfect sphere, we may very well have a more clear, simple division of light and shadow. But with the somewhat organic structure of the egg, we have a more irregular shadow shape. So at this point, any questions as to what I've done? Are people following how I'm interpreting the light and shadow that I'm looking at on the object? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to block in the light and shadow. So I'm going to do this in an ultra simple way at first. So I am just going to block in these areas as very simple shapes of value. And I'm going to find the average value or I'm going to try to determine the average value. Okay, so I'm going to take my HB pencil. And I'm going to start blocking in by just laying in very broadly a kind of middle dark value. And I'm not right now paying attention to being all that careful about staying within those lines I've used to indicate the light and the dark mass. So I can clean that up afterwards. So this is just a more efficient way to block in a simple value. So I mean, in a sense, not even, right now, I'm just very broadly blocking it. I'm not even really looking at specifics on the object because we've done a lot of very specific looking up until now. What I'm really doing is just trying to block in what I'm going to identify as the average value of the shadow side of the form. So I'm going to go back and forth over this. And then what I'm going to do once I have a good value blocked in is then I'll go back in and erase out where the pencil has gone over the contours of the object. Or gone over the contours of the shadow masses that I laid. So even with this very simple block-in of light and shadow, I think people can see how we already start to have a sense of an object under a light source, even a sense of volume. Even this very simple approach is starting to give us something like a convincing illusion. Now, I'm going to go in, and if I were to continue this just as my own drawing, I would go in and clean up that shadow mass. So all of these variations that are created by overlapping pencil marks, I would clean them up so that I have a completely consistent shadow mass to work with. There are some artists, I always try to do rendering of light and shadow without smudging. So I know a very common, sort of high school approach to rendering light and shadow is to smudge, to get maybe a paper towel and blend all this together. I think it creates a kind of ugly, greasy looking rendering. Now, I will say that there are artists who I think actually do beautiful drawings who do that. So you're going to, if you further explore what we're talking about today, you may encounter artists who encourage blending. I think it's particularly bad to do with graphite because, again, it creates this illusion of a kind of greasy stain. So I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to tell people in the class not to do it. But that's something that ultimately you'll want to decide on your own. Okay, so I think right now I'm actually going to do a little bit of cleaning up on this before we go to the next step. But I don't want to torture people as I do that. So I think what we'll do is we'll take our class break right now, and then we'll get started again we'll take our 20-minute mid-class break, and we'll get started again at 11:52. So any questions until then? Okay, so I'll see you all back here at 11:52. Okay, so let's pick this up. So I cleaned up my drawing a little bit. I will, so after the initial lock-in of the large masses of light and shadow, I mentioned that I would go in and clean up some of the variation. So what I mean by that, if anyone's interested in this, what I do is I go in with an eraser. And so I would ultimately want to have a completely integrated value. So without these little variations in there. So I would go in with an eraser and just start to pull out a little bit where it's darker. I would and then I would go in and fill in areas where it's a little bit lighter. And so now I'm doing this just because sometimes people ask how to create this totally integrated sense of, or how to create a totally integrated sense of value. So if you wanted to do a kind of drawing like we saw in that sphere that we looked at the beginning of class, that artist did something like this. Like that artist did not smudge. But not everybody wants to create a drawing that has that kind of sort of perfect transitions of values, and that's fine. You don't have to. As long as you make a drawing that has a big sense of the light and dark and has a good sense of the form, that's all that matters. A kind of perfectly integrated transition of values, that's purely a stylistic choice. It's not a requirement. I happen to have a certain attraction to drawings like that, but that's just my taste. So again, if I were doing this as my own finished drawing, I would now go in here And I would go in between the darker lines to make this all one value. But again, not something you have to do, especially with that kind of thoroughness. Okay, so now what I want to do in this drawing, the assignment this week, is I want to start developing a full sense of the volume by looking for those elements of light and shadow we talked about. So what we've done so far is we've masked in the light side and the dark side, right? The light and the shadow, light mask, dark mask, whatever term we want to use. We've indicated the cast shadow. Now I'm going to look for those further elements of light and shadow. So that means I'm going to look for reflected light and core of reflected light, core of the shadow, halftones, and shadow accents. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start building up the core of the shadow. So along the shadow edge, there's that darker part of the shadow that's created by, as we said, it's created by light bouncing into the shadow and creating a lighter area here, right? And that lighter area right there makes this area appear darker. So I'm going to look at the shape of the core of the shadow and start building that up. So the shape of the core of the shadow isn't just some randomly masked in shape. It has a specific shape, right? It's a little bit, it appears to be a little bit thinner here, a little wider here, again, a little bit thicker there. And it transitions into the reflected light in a specific way, not just in a kind of random, arbitrary way. So I'm looking for that core of the shadow and trying to indicate the specifics of exactly what it looks like and how it transitions into the reflected light. As I'm doing this, again, because of the way I like to draw, I'm going to be refining and sort of, as I put in these tones, I'm going to be thinking about how I knit them together so that they end up with a soft transition. So now by having built up the core of the shadow, we're starting to see reflected light. And I'll continue to refine that. So one thing to bear in mind, a really important thing, is that the reflected light can never be as light as the light mass. So the reflected light is always darker than the light. So make sure you always keep your reflected light darker than the light. So I'm certainly not finished with the reflected light, but I want to start looking at other elements of the light and shadow. So I'm going to start bring some clarity into the drawing. I'm going to indicate the occlusion shadow or the shadow accent. And so the part of the shadow that's darkest as the egg rolls underneath to the underside that we can't see. And the gap between the egg and the tabletop gets smaller and smaller, so less light is getting in. So I'm going to bring in that occlusion shadow. And the occlusion shadow transitions softly into the main part of the dark. So something I absolutely do not want to neglect is the halftone that transitions this edge, right? We don't want that harsh edge, right? So I'm going to start transitioning that edge. I'm going to look at how wide the halftone is. So I'm following that halftone as it again softens the edge of the shadow mass and transitions it into light. So we always want to maintain a clear sense of the shape of the light, the shape of the dark. We don't want to lose that, no matter how soft our transition gets, no matter how soft that rendering gets. So again, we want to maintain a clarity of the light shape and the dark shape. But where you want to lose clarity is pinpointing exactly where the shadow ends, and the halftone begins. That transition can be very subtle and soft, as long as you keep a clear sense of the light shade and the dark shade. So I'm going to, as I'm bringing in the halftone, the marks that were made when I traced out the shadow mass are sort of being filled in. So I'm going to go in and erase those because they're creating a kind of line. And then I'm going to continue to just use my pencil to soften that edge. So I'm just sort of it's as if I'm sanding down that corner. Just bringing in this tone that takes what used to be a sharp corner, and I'm sort of sanding it down. So that corner starts to turn. We start to get a sense of the light rolling around a form, or the form rolling around, and that turning being revealed to us by the light as the light progressively diminishes as the form turns more and more away from it. And notice how there's a softer transition from the dark into the light here than there is here. It's subtle, but it's there. So you want to look for those variations in how much or in how quickly the transition happens from the shadow to the halftone. So in some places, the transition is it happens more quickly. And in some places it happens more slowly. So we now have a drawing that has all of the elements of light and shadow at least begun. One thing we don't have is a highlight, and in this drawing, I'm not. There's a very subtle highlight right around here. So in this drawing, we would have to give a slight tone to the egg itself, darken the background to really be able to pull out the subtlety of that highlight. And because of the texture of an egg, the highlight isn't even that pronounced. I have a feeling in that video we watched, I have a feeling they varnished the egg in order to give it a slightly more visible highlight. So I'm not going to worry about the highlight in this demonstration, and I'm not going to require that be part of the drawing you handed. But all these other elements of light and shadow we're looking for and finding. So the major light and dark, light side and dark side, core of the shadow, reflected light, halftone, cast shadow, occlusion shadow or shadow accent, those should all be there. You should find all of those elements in your drawing of your egg. So this is now, so we have the elements of light and shadow again. This is now simply an issue of continuing to look, continuing to try to get the shape of this core of the shadow compared to the reflected light, get the fullness of the transition of halftones from shadow into light. Fully work out all the elements of the values in the cast shadow. So does anybody have any questions about anything up to this point?
So when you are making the shadow that you have on the right side and you were just kind of doing those pencil strokes, should we like blend with our fingers to make it less, you know, if there are like a lot of lines that you can see, or kind of just try to like use the pencil to blend it out?
Yeah, don't blend with your fingers. Again, because as I was saying, smudging tends to make a kind of greasy, you end up with a tone that has a kind of greasy look to it.
Don't people blend with the tissue too as well, or?
We'll say it again.
Don't some people blend with like a tissue or something?
Yeah, some people do. Well, what's the question? I mean, is that the question? I mean, what I'm saying is that you shouldn't smudge. So maybe I wasn't clear by using the term smudge. The issue is that when you smudge, or when you, as you say, blend with a tissue or with your fingers, you end up with a tone that looks like a grease stain. And so I think that it doesn't have as, I mean, a couple things happen. One is you end up, like when you smudge, you end up reinforcing the flatness of the surface. So I recommend just building up tone with strokes of the drawing tool. So again, when you blend, when you smudge, you know, when you're using just the marks of the tool, you're really looking at what you're drawing and, you know, adjusting the marks so that you're trying to capture what you're seeing up there. And then if you go in with like a tissue or your finger and blend that all together, then you kind of like obliterate it. It's, you know, it's kind of like very carefully building like a structure out of blocks and then knocking all the blocks down. Like you lose all the clarity of the articulation that you've achieved by making the lines with the pencil.
Right.
So I'm going to say at this point, just render the light and shadow with marks of the pencil.
All right, thank you.
Sure. So, I feel a little bit like I have to acknowledge something about that. So let's just talk about that for a second, because that's that comes up a lot. Let's talk about that a little bit further. So I'm going to switch share for a second. I'm going to go back to another YouTube video. So along the lines of the question about blending with the tissue or blending with your finger. Blending with your finger, do not blend with your finger, because if you blend with your finger, you're depositing dirt and body oil onto the paper, and that can create all kinds of problems. But I'm going to relent a little bit in my resistance to blending with, blending with something other than other than the pencil, because too many artists do it. And, and I can't say that they're not doing successful drawing. So let me show you, I'll show you a video. Okay, so this is another person who has a lot of videos online, and they are very useful. And this is his drawing. So whatever you think of this drawing in terms of like its ultimate value of a work of art, this guy certainly knows how to draw, right? So if we look at this, this short video he does of the value sphere. So another version of this assignment is to do the drawing out of your head, where you imagine a sphere and then you apply what you know about light and shadow to a value sphere. So he walks you through the steps of that. And for anyone who wants like further information about what we're studying right now, light and shadow, this video is excellent. You can look up this guy, Stephen Bauman, value sphere. So let's just go through this video very quickly. We won't watch the whole thing. But so he walks you through setting it up.
And talk about as the progress. So this is our little sort of.
Okay, so he talks about setting up the light and shadow. He shows the direction of the light.
Arrow kind of showing us what percent of the 10, more or less kind of parallel.
He talks in considerable detail, what happens with light on
this
a
light
form.
source and parallel to other secondary source.
Okay, then he blocks in.
Speaking later on, so if you're
Then he blocks in. Let's go back. He blocks in very broadly, sort of like I did with the pencil.
squinting down, will have a tendency to unify.
And now one thing I want to point out, notice he doesn't pay any attention to the line between the sphere and the cast shadow. Neither did I. There's no reason to fill in just the sphere and then the cast shadow. You just block in that entire shadow mass. Okay, so he blocks in with the pencil.
Together, the shadow values. So this is kind of the first phase of development in this section of the drawing. Now, I may or may not kind of talk throughout the entire process of this, just because maybe there's more work to be done than thoughts to be expressed.
I don't know why it's freezing. Okay.
But I will kind of continue speaking later on. So if you're
Okay, so what he's doing is he's blending. And what he's using to do the blending is called a blending stump. So I'm going to relent a little bit. If people really want, I mean,
Watching this, and I kind of go quiet for a little while.
I don't know
Not
why
because I'm
it's,
never going to say anything again. It's only because I've just got to get some labor done on go to the highlight.
so he unifies with that stump, and then he goes back in and continues rendering. So you'll notice here he's rendering with the pencil, continuing to render and block in. You know, and he does build up to the highlight. So
To do with highlights is not dissimilar from that. I tend to treat the highlight as something so bright that it tends to bleach out a little bit the area around it.
okay, so having shown that, and I have to admit, if you know, we'll take that one step further. I'll show you a couple drawings by Prud'homme, a couple other drawings by Prud'homme. So first, let's look at this drawing just to talk about some things we were talking about earlier. I don't know why it's coming up in Photoshop, but it doesn't matter. So this is a drawing by Prud'homme where, I don't know why, sorry, my computer, for whatever reason, my computer's acting up a little bit. So this is a drawing by Prud'homme, and notice how different parts of this, we can see different ways he started the drawing. So this is the beginning of, you know, this is part of the drawing that's still in the beginning stage. So notice a couple things. Notice how he's blocking out the line with these relatively straight lines. Then he's blocking in just a very simple dark mass and a light mass. You know, we can see here, we can still see the lines of the dark, the light and dark. And then he slowly starts to build up more and more information, right? Prud'homme does also use a blending stump. So Prud'homme will block in a big area of charcoal, and then he'll stump it so that he blends and creates a unified value. But really important, notice then he goes back over it with directional lines so that he never just leaves it as this kind of sort of stain-like blending. So I'm going to, you know, relent on my, I think it leads, blending with a tissue or a stump usually leads to flaws in the drawing, unless it is done really carefully. But so, having said that, let's go back to our drawing. So if people want, you can take, you know, something like one of these. These are blending stumps. So what they are is they're just either compressed paper or tightly wound paper. If you really want, you can go in with a blending stump. You know, once you have a good amount of the mass blocked in, you can go in and then blend with the blending stump if you want to give it a kind of, you know, quick unification. Again, my problem, my issue with it is I feel like it creates, especially with graphite, you know, unless it's done really carefully, really judiciously, I feel like it creates a sort of greasy looking transition, because graphite is actually a kind of greasy substance. So these blend, now really, in my opinion, a blending stump should only be used once you get it to about this point. Because then you can go in and very gently start to make those transitions just a little bit softer. I'm not sure it's showing up on the screen. But you want to do most of your work with your drawing tool. And then this is a kind of just a finishing. So you don't want to make the halftone by dragging over the tone you've put down for the shadow. You always want to put in the halftone with your pencil and then use the blending stump as a kind of final knitting together. I highly recommend one of these. You can easily get them. If people use Amazon, I bet you could go on Amazon and get one, delivered in a couple days, or you can get them at almost any art. You can get them at any art supply store. Blending with tissue is just a little bit like the idea would be about the same, but it's just a little bit more, I guess it's fine. I don't know that you can really see on the screen difference it's making, but you want to be doing at any rate, whether people choose to use a blending stump or a tissue, you want to use the two approaches together. You don't want to just put a little bit of tone down and then go in and sort of like blend the hell out of that little bit of tone you put down. You always want to move from one to the other. So I'm going to leave that up to people. I'll again, just because I see a lot of artists who in the end make beautiful drawings and they're using that technique, so I guess I can't argue with it. The other aspect of, I just want to emphasize something. So if we go back to this guy here, the other thing you don't want to neglect if you're going to use a blending stump is you don't want to neglect using your pencil in such a way that you're constantly moving around the form. So notice in this drawing,
Now, we could discuss for a long time.
sorry, let me just, I don't know why I'm buffering here. Let me see what's going on with my Wi-Fi. Sorry about this. Oh, floor 3 EXT, floor 3 5T, floor 3 EXT2. Okay, well, I'll keep it on this small one. I think that's when it happens.
How real or artificial this conception is.
Sorry, something about the Wi-Fi today is not letting this work very well. But if we just go back quickly to what among one of the many drawings we've looked at. Let's just take, instead of going back to Michelangelo, let's go to Raphael. So if we look at these drawings, notice how the artists, and this is true in virtually all drawings, the artist is using the direction of the marks to reinforce the volume. Right? So the artist is doing everything they can to reinforce the fullness of the form. So another issue with stumping or blending is that you lose sight of that necessity to constantly be reinforcing the sense of volume. And just if you remember again to that point I keep emphasizing, we're trying to convince the viewer that they're not looking at a flat surface, right? That they're really looking at three-dimensional volumes in space. And if you use a stump or you use some blending tool, a smudging tool, the wrong way, you lose sight of that element of drawing. And that's something I don't want people to lose sight of. So you always want to be making sure that if you are going to use a blending stump, that you're doing it in conjunction with an active use of mark making. Yeah, something's acting up today. I don't know why. I apologize. This off. Oh, here we go. Can people see this? Do people see the drawing?
We see your drawing.
My drawing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So okay. So again, if people really want to do that, that's fine. I highly recommend, if you're interested in that, getting blending stumps and certainly not using your fingers. And I think a blending stump is more useful than a paper towel. Okay. So, and again, you want to use it back and forth. You want to go back and forth between mark making and the blending stuff. So, I've used that stump a little bit to create some of the transitions or to soften some of the transitions. So now I'm going to continue to look for the halftone as it transitions into the light. Continue to build that up. So just as I'm looking at the, just to point out something that you want to look for. So notice right here, and I don't know if people can see this, right here, I'm reading the transition from dark into light as being a slightly more abrupt or slightly harsher than the transition here. The transition there is a little bit softer. And I'm really going to pay attention to those differences. So I'm now going to concentrate on softening this transition here. Because to make a rendering that seems believable, that seems to convincingly depict an organic object and all of its irregularity, you want to look for those variations. So the variations in the degree of softness or hardness of the way the light transitions, or the way the shadow transitions into the light. So I'm going to now work on softening this shadow edge up near the top. So that transition's a little bit softer than this transition here. So, and again, it's just a process of looking, finding those elements of light and shadow and looking really carefully at exactly how they transition into one another. Now, I don't think that it's necessary for me to continue to refine while you're all watching. I'll do a little bit more work on this drawing and before I post the final product. Does anybody have any questions, or can I answer any questions at this point?
In the YouTube video, when he didn't see the end, so I don't know if he changed it. So in your egg, even where the cast shadow is, there's still a line so that you can see the bottom of the egg, even though it's in shadow. In the video, just as far as we saw, he didn't have a defined line. It kind of just went straight into the shadow. Should we have that defined line there?
Line here?
Yeah, and also a little bit to the right and up.
This
Like,
here?
like in the middle of the shadow, yeah, around there. That whole thing, yeah.
Well, I have it because I can see a shadow. I guess he was just imagining a light and dark situation where it's not clear, right? But I mean, yeah, I have that there because I can see a difference between the edge of the egg and what's behind it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, he must have, I didn't even notice that in the video, but he must have just been imagining a situation where you couldn't see that. And that depending on if this were a light gray tabletop, you might not see that division. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, so base it on what you're looking at. So make the division between the egg and the cast shadow as clear or as subtle as it appears to you based on your setup, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? So, obviously the assignment for next week is to set up an egg, just a simple egg, and illuminate it with a single light source and illuminate it. And this is important. You want to illuminate it so that you can clearly see a light side and a dark side. You don't want to illuminate it so that, you don't want to illuminate it so that the light is sort of in front of the egg and you don't see a shadow, right? So I've moved the light so it's getting rid of all shadow. You have to have the light sufficiently off to the side so that you have a clearly discernible shadow pattern, okay? And so setting up your egg with a clear light and shadow and then rendering it, looking for those elements of light and shadow that we talked about. Light mass, dark mass, cast shadow, core of the shadow, reflected light, halftone, and occlusion shadow. And I will post all of those materials that we looked at today. Again, I'll have them posted by, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow.
And you said it's okay to do it on 9x12 paper?
9, it's fine, 9x12, yes. I would cut down your drawing paper because printer paper doesn't have a good enough texture to do a really good drawing on. So
I
I
have
would,
a sketchbook that's 9x12. That's
yeah,
okay.
that's fine, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so any other questions?
I do prefer after class.
Sure.